Yes.
My name is Marie Levette Caduto. I am with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, and I'm also the Vice President of the Connecticut River Joint Commissions, who are hosting this today with many partners, including Antioch University, VHCB, and the town of Keene, all speaking and bringing this together today. So first, thank you to all of our partners and making this happen. And thank you for taking the day to come and do this today and add your voices to this conversation, because we really need that. We really need a lot of partners on board and working towards this goal. This is the fifth in a series on climate migration that CRJC and Antioch have been hosting over the past year and a half, 2 years now. So I don't know if this is if there's going to be more after this, but we'll see where this one today takes us. So just so you know, the Connecticut River Joint Commissions is a bi-state legislative mandated organization that works. Basically, our mandate is to look after and oversee the landscape development, whatever happens in the Connecticut River Valley of Vermont and New Hampshire. So we have 5 local river subcommittees from the top against Canada down to the Massachusetts border, 5 local groups that are subcommittees of the main commission, which is made up of representatives from both sides of the river. We do all kinds of stuff. We just did one of these on agriculture. We hit on a lot of the landscape aspects of the Connecticut River, as well as the water quality and habitat aspects of the Connecticut River Valley. So that's our focus. When you think about, what we're here to talk about today as far as climate migration, housing, environmental connections, and how those pieces all fit together, 2.4 million people live in the Connecticut River watershed. And we're within 2 hours of 11 million people. So when you think about this region being labeled, a climate haven, there are climate migrants here now. There are people here now who aren't getting well housed, and there are probably lots more coming over the next couple of decades. So that's what prompted this series to begin with. And hopefully, as we come together and have these discussions and figure out how do we start and move forward with dealing with this. And to do that, I probably covered most of what I was supposed to say. I'm going to let the speakers introduce themselves when they get up here, rather than me trying to do it. But we just wanted to start with kind of getting on the same page with what this is and why we're here, what we want to talk about. And I'm coming from this, I am a watershed planner. So I cover work on rivers, lakes, streams, ponds, how we manage those, how we improve, protect water quality, how we improve, protect aquatic habitats and adjacent habitats, and how we work with flood resiliency, because that's become a very big part of the watershed planning work, is dealing with the resiliency aspects of it. So I'm coming from with this talk from a water quality, habitat, environmental perspective. And I know there's a lot of the housing here, and that's where we need to cross, right? We need to cross those paths. When people talk about climate resiliency, there's all kinds of definitions out there. And when you read through them all, it kind of comes down to 2 things. How do we minimize harm? And how do we recover from the harm that gets done and the events that happen to us climate-wise? So, as a broader concept, we're looking at climate resiliency, and from my perspective, that's watershed resiliency. How do we make the landscape function in a way that does all these things, that protects water quality, that protects aquatic habitat and terrestrial habitat around it, that protects people from being in harm's way, that protects our infrastructure? All of those pieces, how do we do that on the landscape? because it's not just a site-by-site issue, it's a landscape issue, it's a watershed issue. And the way we have been working with that as watershed planners is to look at accessing floodplains. How do we get the water onto the land? We've worked for hundreds of years to get the water off the land. We need to reverse that, get it back on the land, onto the floodplain, so it slows down, settles out, stores water on the landscape before it hammers the village below. We need to look at how we have structured our infrastructure, which is with 2 small bridges, 2 small culverts, dams that are forcing the river into a pattern that it's not comfortable with. And looking at those natural river systems and how the water flows and what's going to be resilient to the climate that we now have. Ultimately, how do we keep people out of harm's way? I was in one of these just 2 weeks ago, and Christine Hazard was one of the speakers of the Brattleboro Housing Partnership, and I absolutely loved how she closed her comments, and this is the only slide I will actually read. But she closed with, when we talk with housers about the Melrose Terrace project, we talk about it because our mission is to help people to remain housed who could potentially lose their housing from a variety of reasons. I don't want it to get missed that flooding is a really key area that housers need to think about. Whenever anybody loses their housing, it creates more of a burden on the number of people we really need to serve. When that is already such a dire situation that any housing loss is too much, it's an important message for us to keep saying. Often our groups, the environmental groups, the housing groups, the planning groups, don't intermingle. When we talk about these things, we need to talk about the importance of not only thinking about flooding for our own housing, but also housing our community. I just thought that was a great kind of way to start this conversation today. It was so on point. So when I'm looking at flood resilience, watershed planning, we have to look forward, right? We're in a situation now that's hazardous. What do we need to do on the landscape today that down the road, as we accumulate these things happening on the landscape, it's going to make the situation better. It's a long-term thing. We're not going to do this overnight. And one of the things I want to just have everybody on the same page with is what we mean when we talk about flooding and what flooding is. So when you think of, there's 2 different kinds of flooding. There's inundation flooding on the left, the right, left. When the water comes up, like along a lake, a huge, large river like the Mississippi, the water comes up, floods the land, might hang out there for days or weeks, wreaking havoc on the structures, and then slowly going down. It's not what we have here. And we have very little inundation flooding in Vermont and New Hampshire. We have fluvial erosion, which is fast, high volume, high velocity waters eroding everything in its path. That was my commute to work after Irene. Made it a very long commute. So when as planners and thinking about these issues, FEMA floodplain maps, which I hope everyone is familiar with, they don't do anything about this. They only deal with that. FEMA floodplain maps are floodplain, the low areas around the rivers, streams. So according to FEMA, this house is not in a hazardous location, right? It's not in the floodplain. It's way above the floodplain. Nobody's going to look at this on a floodplain map and say, oh, we should watch out for that. So that's where we need to be thinking. These, however, were in the floodplain. They are no longer. Businesses, homes, that's just the 2nd floor of the house. And infrastructure, like how we get to our houses, how we get out of them when we really need to, how emergency services get to us. All of these things are why we want to be dealing with flood resiliency and getting people out of harm's way. This was my neighborhood 3 days after Irene, when of the 5 roads, they finally got 1 lane open off the hill and had run out of signs. So if you can't read that, it says frost heaves ahead. It was the only sign they had left, I guess. And you know, we think about what we do on the landscape, and we have been manipulating our rivers and streams and shores for literally centuries. And I love this slide to illustrate that, because this was taken right after the 1927 floods. So all this stuff had been done over 100 years ago, and probably some of it 200 years ago. You can see the railroad track in there. They cut off this meander bend with the railroad. They cut off that meander bend with the railroad. Somebody moved the river from here to there so they could make a bigger field, easier to farm. So they took a river that was a meandering, bendy river and turned it into a fire hose. Straight shot. I would not want to live under that logo, because you're going to get hammered by fast, straight flowing water coming right at you. So we've been straightening our rivers for centuries, and we've been doing lots and lots of other things. We channel it, we rock line it, we put berms up against the rivers so they can't access their floodplains. We remove the gravel, which the river needs. You pick up a rock and move it from here to there, you expend energy. The river does the same thing. We want it to lose energy. Our structures are way too small. We build on over our rivers so we don't give them any room to move. And when they do move, we armor the banks so they can't. All of these things are making our flood resiliency far worse. So as we look at the landscape and we look at where housing goes, where we need to get people out of harm's way, these are all the things that are causing the harm. So that nexus, when we think about housing, and I'm not a houser, so there's probably way more on this list than I can come up with. We want affordable, good housing for everybody. We need that for stability for families. We need it stability for our economic communities. We need it to be able to provide growth opportunities, which is what's going on in my town right now. And we need safety from the hazards that are out there. And when we do projects for flood resiliency and watershed work, we look at water quality. We look at wildlife habitat, wildlife corridors, floodplain resiliency, public access to our waterways for recreation, creates jobs, brings in visitors. So when you do one of these things, you're impacting the other. Right? When you do one of those projects, you're impacting these. So the nexus between the two is really important. It's a really key piece of how do we plan to move forward on this work. And I hope everyone accepts that climate change is happening here, and it's impacting our natural resources, it's impacting our housing. We need long-term change. We need to plan and make these things happen. And we need to cross those sectors, the environment, the housing, the planning, the food security, all of those things are spokes out of what's happening with climate change. And as we work on one, we're working on all of them. But it takes time. We need to build that kind of support. We need to have these discussions to bring people in and understand what all those spokes are, because I don't think anybody actually knows all of them and how they all relate to each other. The strategies that we come up with are going to have to be different. We've got rural landscapes, we've got mixed-use landscapes, we've got urban landscapes. We know people are coming, so how do we work with that? We can do better, and we have been getting some things right. This is Melrose Terrace, which you're going to hear about from others as we speak. This is in West Brattleboro on the Whetstone Brook. It was a housing development for elderly and disabled. It got flooded all the time. Water would always come up, they'd evacuate, everybody would go back home. Tropical Storm Irene pretty much wiped out most of the buildings. They could not go back there. So between the state and the housing authority, and I'm sure lots of other partners, VHCB included, right? They built a new facility, got people out of harm's way, took down all the buildings, and turned it back into floodplain. In July, last July, it used the floodplain. The water came up, spread out, formed a channel around, nobody got hurt, set the flooding levels downstream from this in Brattleboro Center were lower. The water was slower. The sediment was dropped out on the floodplain. Nobody got hurt. Rural situations and undersized structures. These two images don't look all that different, but you'll see on the left, that big black spot, that's an old dam. The dam had already been breached. Half of it had fallen down. But during Irene, that little constriction there was enough to raise the water level behind that dam high enough that it took out a beautiful historic barn on the left side there. That constriction funneled the water straight at this bank, that fire hose effect of constrictions. Took out 200 feet of this road, Harrington Road, which is a dead end, of course. Houses up there had no access, in, out, emergency. It was all gone until they were able to get 200 feet of road back. So some of these projects aren't big deals. All we did was take down the high part of the dam. In July, the water had the whole channel to flow through. It didn't back up, it flowed over everything, didn't hammer the bank, didn't hammer the bridge downstream. Nobody was in harm's way because the water levels were lower. And this one you'll hear about as well. This is a 12-acre parcel. This is Brattleboro, flat street here. All of this was flooded during Irene. So when this parcel floods, this whole area can potentially flood. 12 acres, old industrial site, contaminated soils, archaeological underground resources to preserve, had been filled with gravel and soil to raise it above the flood levels, and bermed all along the brook. So we had the opportunity, because they weren't using that lot, we purchased a river corridor easement, which is a land protection easement, and we bought the parcel with partners. The state of Vermont, EPA paid for all the contamination cleanup. The HCB was involved in getting the funding together to do the easement and the purchase. The town of Brattleboro has been running it. The Vermont River Conservancy is now the owner of this parcel and managing it. So all of these structures, that's the parcel, all of these structures are downstream in the hazard area. So we took this lot, which in 2015, I started this project in 2007. It got finished last fall. These are long-term commitments. So that's what it looked like, just big gravel parking lot. This is what it looked like midsummer last summer, which was removing all the contaminated soils, removing the soil to bring the floodplain back down to a level where the flood can access it, removing the berms, and finally replanting it. Some of these projects are small scale, some of these projects are large scale, and they all have an impact, but now there's 12 acres of flood storage right above downtown Brattleboro. We still have work to do. We're still rebuilding the same places that we know are going to get hammered again. We're still working on, it's going to take us a long time to upsize all our undersized structures. And Jason and I were just talking, that was a meeting tonight with AOT to enlarge this bridge. Like, it's my town. I'm happy. But that White House is going to get hit again. And that's more housing that's not available for people. And all of the houses around it also got hit. And this is right in the village. So I often close, when I talk about floodplain work and riparian buffer work, I love this quote. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the next best time is now. I put out that the best time to make a plan was 20 years ago, and the next best time is now. So we need to start. We need to really get together, have these conversations, and figure out where to go next. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Krista, and I will let you
Sure.
go
So
for it.
before we begin,
Actually, I'm going to give you this.
oh yeah, and I'm not really going to do a lot of talking right now. You guys are going to do the talking, and really, we're probably going to do this for about 5 minutes, just because we're a little bit behind. But we're going to do something called connection before content, and this is where we're going to just have a quick discussion in groups. I call them triples. The best size group is 3 to 4. If you got 5 at a table, that's fine. If you want to move around, that's even better. Not 2, so 2 should go with somebody else. Twos are not good. And so just quickly, in your little table, in your head, what would your community look like if it had sustainable, resilient, affordable housing? And when I say affordable, I mean low to middle income as well, right? And land conservation. What does that look like in your head before hearing from all the speakers? And so we're going to do this. I'm going to time us for about 5 minutes since we're a little behind. But if the 2 could join others, or others will join you, we can start just in your group. What does that look like? Big picture. Big picture. Perfect. All right. I hate to cut this short, but we want to keep you on time so everybody gets to leave at noon. So, maybe we can start with just a quick popcorn out, which is not everybody's reporting out, but a couple ideas that came out of your conversation. Very small conversation. Sometimes these last, when you have an all-day workshop, like 15 minutes. So this was a little quick snippet of how it usually is run. But any thoughts? Anybody? Anything that came up at your table that you're like, that was a great idea? Or that was a horrible idea? Mari?
I thought a really interesting point was in terms of conservation, also thinking about the opportunity to grow food, because that helps create a connection to the land. So that was an idea that someone in our group had that I thought was interesting and really cool. So for housing, building in opportunities to grow food.
Yeah.
Community gardens and things like that.
Absolutely. Anybody else? Yes.
A couple of ideas here. One is designated areas to encourage development that are appropriate in terms of floodplain and wildlife habitat, forest habitat, so designated areas of incentives. And the second one was to discourage further development in more rural areas, further into the woods and the forest blocks, by providing incentives to build close to the road. For example, having the town take over private roads, so the cost of maintaining the roads borne by the town, and people are discouraged from building further out into the woods because they're closer to them. So those are
Yeah. Anybody else? Some neat ideas you heard? Go ahead, Beth.
We didn't discuss this, but I used to work for a school system down in Maryland, and so I was really into schools.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of property
Yes.
all over the country. And so California is building affordable housing on school campuses. And I'm wondering if anyone's seen that around here as a possibility. Because you can pitch it as, teachers can live here, and you can sneak in other people.
I like that. Sneak in other people.
And they've got the infrastructure. What we did talk about is sewer and water.
Yeah.
When you don't have it, that's a huge obstacle. How do you sell that to a little town?
Right. It is an obstacle. Any other ideas? All right, perfect. Well, we're going to hear a lot of ideas with the next couple speakers, and we're going to dive into this again at the end. And it'll be interesting after you go through this process if your thoughts change at all by the time we get to the end. So I'd love to hear that too. So think about what you came in with on what this would look like. And then when we come back together at the end, we're going to talk a little bit again about if that has changed for you or your perceptions are still pretty much the same. So with that, I want to keep us on time and not have you late. I'm going to introduce Polly, and Polly's going to introduce herself. Oh, good. Everything somehow magically appeared on the screen while I was talking. What a great day.
There we go. Good morning, everyone. My name is Polly Major. I'm the Director of Policy and Special Projects for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And I was going to present today with my colleague Trey Martin, who's our Director of Conservation and Rural Development, but he unfortunately wasn't able to make it. So I'm going to pinch hit his slides. As a full disclosure, I've been working with VHCB for about a year and a half now, but I came over from Senator Leahy's office where I covered housing policy. So I'm really coming to this from a housing point of view and adopting the conservation work as well now in this new role. So I'm glad Marie set us up with this really water quality and river focus, and I can build on that to talk about balancing that with conservation or with housing. So I want to just get a sense of who's in the room and your familiarity with VHCB. So I can titrate how I talk about our work to you. So because we just work in Vermont, can I see a show of hands of everyone who works in New Hampshire? All right, so it looks like about half the room. I'm going to assume everyone else is Vermont at this point. And so I love that Krista started with this popcorn slide of having us in groups talking about what does it look like to have housing and conservation together in a community. Because a lot of what I'm going to do in this presentation is show examples through our 35-year history of what projects have looked like when they take into account both housing and conservation. And I have a couple kind of goals for the presentation today. I want to introduce you to Vermont Housing and Conservation Board and our work and talk about how funding decisions can take into account and balance the needs of housing and conservation. I want to talk about times that is a challenge and how that has been a challenge through the arc of our history. Like I said, I want to show community projects where this has been a success, and I loved hearing the popcorn ideas because it made me think of other projects as well that we have done in Putney right now. We're helping to fund both a affordable housing development, but also to conserve the adjacent lot that has the community gardens on it. And we are working to rehab a school in Barrie that is no longer operating as a school, so it's being turned into housing. There's a lot of conversations in Vermont about vacant college campuses and how can we incorporate housing there, so more to come. And I want to draw the connection between VHCB's dual goal mission that started as a response to a real estate crisis, really, to how that is now being used as a response to climate change and as a way to improve resiliency in our communities. So let me pull up where this is. Let's see. Majestic. How do I access this on here?
Let's see, the mouse is up, so you should just be able to scroll on the keyboard as long as the mouse in front of it.
Oh, okay. Can I pull it up here so I can see what the slides I'm talking about?
If I can find a cursor.
That's, yeah.
Just pull it over to the left a little bit more, and you'll get there.
Oh, there we go. Oh, I see. It's two screens. Got it. All right. We're good.
You want to switch it to just
I just want to get to, it
display.
should be here. That what you need?
Nope, that is neither that nor that.
All right.
Sorry, folks. There we go. Okay.
And then you should just go.
All right, so I want to start by talking about a little bit of our history. And the picture you see here on the right is in Bennington County. It's the Bennington-Shaftesbury line. And we use this picture because it shows a really historic development pattern across the Northeast, a pattern of dense settlements by water surrounded by this working landscape. And this was identified in a commission in Vermont in the 1920s as kind of the archetypal development pattern of the state, and one that is core to our character and one that the state wants to preserve. And that's really been a through line, whether it be for character, whether it be for smart growth, whether it be for resilience, that we are focused on how do we have these villages surrounded by open working landscape. And I think how we define working landscape is something that's evolved from agriculture to recreation to working by retaining water and protecting our downtowns or retaining a place for biodiversity. VHCB was started in the 1980s when we saw, much like today, a really hot real estate market that was challenging both farmers who wanted to have access to affordable land for food production and the rural economy, also to Vermonters who wanted to find an affordable place to live. Similarly, we were seeing in-migration that was pushing up the price of housing, and that was displacing populations internally. So the response to these twin real estate pressures was a group of organizations that worked to conserve land and organizations that worked to build affordable housing came together and formed the Vermont Housing and Conservation Coalition. This is a coalition that persists through to today. And that coalition went to the Vermont legislature and advocated for a fund that was going to fund both housing and conservation. That resulted in the creation of VHCB. We're a quasi-state agency, so we function as a state agency in Vermont that funds affordable housing, that funds land conservation, but we have an independent board, and we're kind of not in line with the administration of the day. Our statutory purpose is really our mission, so I'll just read that, and it's for the dual goals of creating affordable housing for Vermonters and conserving and protecting Vermont's agricultural land, forest land, historic properties, important natural areas, and recreational lands for the primary importance of the economic vitality and quality of life for the state of Vermont. And as we look at what does economic vitality and quality of life mean, more and more to us that means resilience. So I want to talk about what that looks like what it looks like to implement that dual goal in one community. So I had shown that aerial picture of Shaftesbury. These are 3 projects we've done through time in Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury is a town that had Stanley Tools as the anchor employer leave in the 1980s, leading to an economic decline. And the town was looking around saying, how can we continue to have economic vitality? And they realized one of the assets they had was Robert Frost's house. And so they came to VHCB and said, we want to preserve this house and we want to turn it into a museum. And we were able to use our conservation mission that incorporates historic preservation to help them achieve that goal. Fast forward 7 or so years, and the land around Lake Perrin, a really beloved lake in town that was used for local recreation but didn't have kind of a public right of access to it, it was just an accepted use, came up for sale, and the community was very concerned that they'd lose that access as the land around it got privatized, got developed for second homes. So a community group came together to conserve a recreation area on Lake Perrin that is very well used today. And in doing so, they didn't just place the whole thing under a conservation easement, but they held out a portion to later develop affordable housing. And it takes time and it takes different resources to pull together affordable housing. But in the last 5 years or so, they did open up, in partnership with a local affordable housing developer, Lake Perrin Village, which is affordable housing development within walking distance of this recreation area of this lake. And here's a resident that was able to move in there with her 2 children. And these are kind of what it looks like over a year for VHCB. And part of the conversation today is about funding. So I want to talk a little bit about where our funding comes from and what it does in terms of achieving a dual goal mission. So the primary funding source for Vermont Housing Conservation Board is the property transfer tax through the state of Vermont. And that is a very appropriate source because as the real estate costs increase, property transfer tax generates more funds, and we're able to direct more funds to populations that aren't able to access land or housing. But what we do in putting these dollars into projects is that we look for chances to leverage other funding sources that might be very siloed to either create just housing or to conserve land. And by bringing them into these projects, we're asking those other funding sources to think about the other side of the mission too, or just to functionally have them do that. I think an example of that that I don't actually have a picture up here of would be that project in Putney that has the community garden right next door to it. The other thing it has is federal home funds. And this is the major federal program that funds affordable housing development. But in this case, it is doing so in a project that has a conservation element to it. Similarly, the major funding that we pull down on the land use side is through USDA and RCS to preserve ag lands. And our board recently had a project in North Hero that we looked to conserve, a really idyllic farm next to a village in North Hero with this federal resource. But in doing so, when our board debated the project, they said, this is right next to the town, and this town has sewer and water. What if it wants to develop? Because people want to live here, it's actually a good rural site for people to live. And so putting together the development easement, they carved out 6 acres that is on the road on sewer and water to enable development there. So that's a way that consideration probably isn't taken into account in most USDA and RCS projects around the country, but by having a board that has to think about both sides of the mission, it's brought into account. The other thing I want to talk about in this slide is you're seeing really siloed results that feed into a system that balances housing and conservation, and also feed into a system that looks at climate change adaptation. So Vermont's Climate Action Plan really gives a mandate across VHCB's mission areas for these. It talks about the importance of producing permanently affordable housing for displaced populations, for vulnerable populations, for populations that will be migrating here. It also talks about the importance of local food systems and allowing the protection of agricultural land so that we can ensure that we have that regional sustainability. And it talks about conserving acres as green infrastructure that's going to help us mitigate and reduce the impacts of climate change. I'm going to touch a little bit on kind of the nitty-gritty of how we do our work in our housing and conservation programs. So for housing, it's a really broad approach to housing across the board. We could do everything from investing in shelters to investing in home ownership with a lot of affordable rental housing in between. A through line that runs through all of our housing programs is that it's going to be permanently affordable. Our mission asks us to prevent displacement. And one of the threats we've seen throughout time to people who are living in naturally occurring affordable housing is when the market allows for a rent increase and they find themselves displaced. And we're certainly seeing that today. So our board and our statute asks us to really have a commitment that when we use state dollars to invest in housing, it's never going to result in the displacement of people with by increasing the rent beyond what they can bear. That is really unique in housing programs nationally. Our federal programs all have terms of affordability, and after that term is up, the private market could, if it is interested, raise those rents and displace people. The picture here, I like to talk about this project because it's one in South Hero that I think really gets to the land use conversation here, and also the climate change mitigation conversation. It's Bayview Apartments is developed by affordable housing senior developer Cathedral Square. And it's a new village center in South Hero where the community came together to build a library, build a commercial center, build the only dental office in Grand Isle County, and build this affordable senior housing all within walking distance of a new town center. And as you can see, solar panels on the roof of the building there, our developers all look to really incorporate best practices and energy in all their buildings when possible. For our conservation programs, we mainly act through the purchase of development rights and placing conservation easements on land. But the type of land varies, as you heard in the statute, from recreational areas, forests, natural areas, to farmland. And then it also looks at how do we, in addition to just preserving the land, how do we ensure that it's economically viable? So we have a farm and forest viability program that provides business planning to farms, and a rural economic development program that provides technical assistance to community projects that are looking to promote either affordable housing or working lands businesses in rural communities. And this project, Camp Dream, is a great example of how we think, another way to think about a dual goal project. It was Camp Dream is a summer camp that was started by 2 AmeriCorps volunteers that came out of Dartmouth College and into VHCB's AmeriCorps program. And they worked in affordable housing sites and realized that the students there didn't have access to summer camps. And so coming out of that experience, they created a summer camp for students that lived in affordable housing. And through our conservation program, that helped them purchase the land for the camp. And this summer, they also purchased the island that's in the lake where the camp is. I meant to touch on it at the beginning, but VHCB administers an AmeriCorps program that places members at housing and conservation organizations across the state. And while this doesn't tangibly result in housing or conservation, it builds a culture of thinking about the two, of connections between the members, many of whom go on to work in these fields in Vermont and kind of carry that vision of balancing housing and conservation forward, or we like to think that they do. So this really gets to the challenge of balance, and it's a very wordy slide. I apologize for that. It's clipped right from the statute. But the key thing that we're thinking about is how do we allocate funds? We're given a lot of flexibility over it, and our statute gives us some parameters for that. And so it really looks at prioritizing dual goal projects. But when we're thinking about dual goal projects, we really have evolved our thinking from just you have to have housing and conservation on one site, which we know as land use practitioners isn't always the best approach, to we have to take into account the outcomes for housing and conservation in every project. One of our favorite parts of the statute is this second piece that asks us to respond to the need for a timely response to unpredictable circumstances or special opportunities to serve the purposes of the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And where we've really used that is to respond to crises, especially around resiliency and climate change. So following Irene, we used that part of the statute to participate in the state's buyout program, because FEMA buyouts would only go to 75% of the value of the home. In certain circumstances, VHCB money would come in, provide the last 25% to ensure that the homeowner was made whole, able to move into another home, hopefully. And then also to place, where it made sense, public access easement on the land. And then also this, these other highlighted parts of the statute that asks us to look at displacement. And that's something we're thinking about more and more with climate change, migration, and the economics that we're working with today. The key to all of this is balance, and what does balance mean? And I think this really gets to land use and the board's discussions on projects like that one I mentioned in the islands, that says, how do we balance the need to conserve a farm with the need to allow growth in an area? I'm not going to dwell too much on this slide, actually, because we heard so much about it from Marie earlier. But again, these are different pictures, but same story of that project in Brattleboro, Melrose Terrace, that flooded so horrifically during Irene, the new affordable housing that was built, again, with a long list of funding partners, VHCB being one of them, and then the floodplain that's in the process of being restored to protect downstream in Brattleboro. When the floods hit this summer, we reached out to the whole network of affordable housing developers to ask them what properties were damaged, what do you need to ensure that your residents stay safely housed. And we were actually surprised how few properties it was. And part of the reason for that is in our funding requirements, there are requirements to build outside of the floodplain when possible, when you have to build in a downtown area, to do so in a way that mitigates climate change, mitigates the impact of flooding. These are a couple pictures after the flooding this summer of Northfield, where I talked about that buyout program. This was 7 homes that is now a park. And this park flooded and was fine. No one was hurt after it. So those homes were bought out after Irene. And this is a different use for the community that is safe and protecting people. And then this is the challenge we have in front of us. This is right after the flooding in Barre this summer, where a low-income community was inundated, and the city is really struggling with how do we rebuild. And if we rebuild with forces driven by the market, it will not be affordable but for the people who are displaced. So how do we balance that, and how do we pull in public funding to ensure that we're building affordably? What we think about a lot is going upstream. So where we can't mitigate by hardening our housing in our downtowns, we're thinking about how to restore floodplains, how to capture water by preserving areas in our open lands. And this is a project, again, in Bennington, that's a preservation of open water outside of town, where you also have access for the public to some beautiful recreation. I got the 10-minute sign, and Murray touched on water quality. So a real core piece of VHCB's work is becoming water quality, and that we really see on our farmland preservation work, where we're looking at preserving buffers to both give an area for flood and to protect the quality of the water coming through the farm areas. I want to talk about one of the greatest challenges here that's facing the board, and that is the pressure for outcomes that are either acres of land preserved or number of houses produced really puts in tension this desire to integrate housing and conservation. I think where we see this most clearly today is with housing, where Vermont has the second highest rate of homelessness increase in the country, highest rate for families. And that is a mandate that we build as much housing as possible to house as many people as possible. But when we look at costs of housing, we see that it's doubled since 2019. And that means that we need to find ways, or are asked to find ways, to use our precious dollars to do as much as possible. Unfortunately, the cheapest way to build housing is to build on a green field and to not incorporate energy efficient technologies. And so if we're only trying to meet that one goal of unit production, which we have a moral imperative to meet, then we're not going to be able to focus on resiliency. And how do we balance that? On the flip side, some of our most valuable land for ag production is often these flat green fields. And one of the most valuable resources we can pull into the federal government, because Vermont can't do it all itself, is that USDA program that's for the preservation of ag land. But how do we prioritize those lands if they're the same lands that we can build the cheapest housing? And this debate is really coming to a head as Vermont looks at modernizing Act 250, our statewide land use regulations, and looks at lifting those regulations in our downtowns and designated growth areas, thereby removing a regulatory protection for our farmlands that are in those areas or adjacent to those areas, meaning that a response could be, let's use funding to protect them. But in doing that, we're using funding to protect the most expensive land and diverting it away from maybe the open lands that can retain water elsewhere. So that land use conversation around Act 250 is really at the heart of how do we balance this? And we see in many ways VHCB as the funding arm, as an implementing agency of that vision of balancing housing and land use. It can be done. I think it can be done with careful planning, but it is hard work. We sit on I think as we think about best case practices for resiliency moving forward, and can I get a time check? 5 minutes, okay. We're not thinking just on what's gonna mitigate climate change, what's gonna protect our downtowns from flooding. We're also thinking, how do we protect our most vulnerable populations and those that are most at risk from climate change? So VHCB sits on the Environmental Justice Council for the state of Vermont, and environmental justice is a process that's kind of driven by a federal process to identify vulnerable populations, to map where those populations are, and then to target funding towards those populations. And we see this really as a increasingly important through line through our work and how we're thinking about directing funding. So one key environmental justice population is mobile home communities. We see them really devastated by floods. This is cheap land where it was affordable to build mobile home parks, and where we have put people in harm's way ever since. So this is the largest park in Vermont, Tri-Park Mobile Home Park in Brattleboro. And you see here a map of the red where the floodway is, the blue where the flood plain is. And you see that there's 16 homes that are in the floodway that VHCB, along with a number of partners, are looking at how to relocate to another place in the park to move them out of harm's way, but protect the economic viability of the park. If you were to just remove 26 homes, 26 families would lose their housing, and the park would lose the income of those lots, and so wouldn't be able to sustain its own infrastructure and its own community. We have 5 minutes, so I'm going to go quickly through some of the things we're thinking about at how we think about going upstream in housing, and a lot of that is around energy efficiency standards. We were chatting in the popcorn session about the bus station in Montpelier, which is this building here. And not only is that a highly energy efficient building, but it's also one built right next to the river where the housing was totally safe this summer, because it was built on top of the bus station, which was built to absorb a flood, be okay in a flood, and protects the housing above it. So there are things we can do to stay true to our downtowns and still protect people. And to kind of end where I started. Smart growth and historic preservation is really at the core of that land use discussion. So these are some projects in St. Johnsbury on the right and Bellows Falls on the left, where there has been historic redevelopment of historic buildings to provide downtown affordable housing, to provide downtown commercial space, and to build more energy efficient housing. And by doing so, we're allowing lack of sprawl. So this is a very classic dual goal project that I like to end on. So as I say, we have evolving thinking about how we meet our dual goals in one project. This is a really classic one because it is one plot of land where we have built both senior housing, family housing, and affordable home ownership in Shelburne, Vermont, and also conserved the La Platte River on the same lot with public access walking trails along it. And then here's another way to think about dual goal, where we have on the right, we have one of the densest developments that we've done. I think this building for homeless veterans was built on a fifth or quarter of an acre. It's not possible on that small of a plot to also conserve a little sliver. It doesn't make sense, nor would you need to do it. But instead, what building in that dense way allows us to do is to conserve landscape scale plots of land, like Willoughby Peaks, this beautiful plot of land in Westmore in the Northeast Kingdom. I see a 1-minute sign and I have a thank you slide. So thank you for the work that you're doing here, and thank you to the planning community, where I understand many of you come from, for taking on that hardest challenge of thinking about across our communities, across our state, how do we balance housing and conservation so there's room for both and we can meet the needs of climate change. Thanks. And who's up next?
It's after.
Oh, okay. So I can invite up my colleague, Mary, who I'm meeting for the first time, but it's nice to meet you from the city of Keene.
Nice to meet you as well. Is that okay if it's sideways?
I think so.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So my name's Mary. I'm gonna figure out how to work this. So I work for the city of Keene, New Hampshire, in the community development department. And before that, I worked with Southwest Region Planning Commission, which is the regional planning commission for the Monadnock region of New Hampshire. And so I'm going to be talking about zoning, which I think is interesting. I know not a lot of people do, but there are a lot of tools in zoning that a local community can use to kind of help resolve some of the tensions between housing development and protecting land. So the way I've decided to talk about this is to first kind of set the stage. So before implementing zoning, kind of best practices are to have your land use plan in place. And also before we made changes to our zoning to promote more housing, gathering the data to really understand what your housing needs are. And we also did a housing vulnerability analysis to really understand also what existing housing that we have that's vulnerable to being lost. And then I'm going to talk about a specific ordinance that just got adopted last week, Thursday, called the Cottage Court Overlay District, which is an infill ordinance. And then briefly touch on some other zoning tools that Keene has taken advantage of. So first of all, zoning should really be grounded in a solid planning process. I'm sure most people know this, but when your community is doing an update to your master plan or your future land use map, it's really important for all voices to be at the table and to talk about these different intersecting goals. So in the city of Keene, we have the map shown on the screen is our future land use map. And it really broadly identifies areas where land should be conserved and where growth should occur. So on this map, it's a little hard to see, but that kind of shaded square in the middle is our primary growth area. Then those sort of light pink areas are our secondary growth area for residential. We've got some like purple areas for industrial and commercial. But then everything else, everything around that is really an area to prioritize conservation and protecting the rural landscape. And just a little bit of background about Keene, its geography. Historically, the city of Keene was basically in where a glacial lake was located. So we kind of, the center of Keene is very flat, and then we're surrounded on all sides by steep slopes. And so we do have a lot of flooding. We have the Ashwellet River and Beaver Brook. We've had some major floods in the past 20 years. And we also have an issue with the groundwater kind of coming up as well. So we've got pretty shallow groundwater. So I mentioned that we did a housing needs assessment. That was done, it was accepted by City Council just about a year ago now. And as part of that analysis, we really wanted to understand what housing was vulnerable, and our biggest issue in Keene is flooding. So we had our consultants work with us to not only look at the FEMA flood maps, but we also mapped out where historical flooding had occurred, because the two are not the same. So everything shown here in this, this dark purple color is where we had a history of flooding that doesn't overlap with the FEMA maps. So you can see that's just from 2 flood events that we have in the purple. The dark blue is the floodway, the light blue is the 100-year floodplain, and the orange is the 500-year floodplain. And so from that, we did a housing vulnerability analysis. It looked at more than just flooding. It also looked at the condition of the home, the quality of the home, who lives in the home. So if we have an area with a lot of low income or elderly individuals, they're probably going to be less able to prepare for and respond to an event. And from that, we did an analysis of all of our existing housing stock that's vulnerable. From this analysis, we found that 395 housing units, or about a little over 6% of our housing stock, is highly vulnerable. We have 984, or about 16%, is moderately vulnerable, and the rest fell into the low vulnerability category. So that was really important for us to understand, both just for our own planning purposes, but also as an education tool for the public and for our decision makers. So again, I'm just gonna flip back and forth here so you can see, here's the area that's flooding, and here's our primary growth area. So there's a lot of overlap between, again, because our valley floor is really the only developable land, everything around it is steep slopes. And that also happens to be where the flooding occurs. So how do we balance those two considerations? So after doing that vulnerability assessment and doing the housing needs assessment, we have a few selected key findings up here. But basically the takeaway was that we need 1,400 new housing units over the next 10 years. So 140 units per year, which is a 14% growth rate, where we've seen something more like a 3 or 4% growth rate in the number of housing units. And at the same time, every year we're losing housing units because they're falling into disrepair, or they're becoming uninhabitable. We have a high percentage of households that are cost burdened. We have a displaced workforce. We have a really high percentage of people that live alone in our community, which is driving some of the demand for housing. And so looking at all of this data, what we decided to propose as a solution is, we're calling it the cottage court overlay, but really this is a residential infill ordinance. So we're trying to promote smaller format housing types to be built on land that's already been developed, or land that's surrounded by developed land and has access to infrastructure that's already in place. It'll be a more cost-effective way to use city resources, but also a more efficient use of land. It's promoting more compact development in a walkable sort of pedestrian scale environment, so that it gives people more choices for transportation as well as housing. And the way that we did that is by providing a lot of flexibility. Like normally, you know, when a developer comes in, we have a minimum lot size, we have a density requirement, we have all these, you know, setbacks and different things, a number of parking spaces. This ordinance, our approach was to say, okay, if you're going to do this, we're going to give you a cap on the average size of the unit, so that, you know, you're really building smaller format housing types. But other than that, they pretty much have a lot of flexibility. And the overall goal here is to increase the density of development, but in order to stay true to the community's vision for their neighborhoods, it has to fit in with the character of the neighborhood. So it's increasing the density, but not the intensity, is kind of how we're putting it. We don't want to see giant, blocky apartment buildings go up in what was historically a duplex, triplex, single-family neighborhood. So to illustrate this concept, we took an existing lot in Keene and sort of anonymized it. And then to illustrate to the community like what could be done here, we proposed a few things. So this is an example of a lot that right now in Keene is in a developed area. It's on a street that has been there since the 1800s. It has water and sewer. It's surrounded by homes, some of which were built 200 years ago, and but you can't develop it, mostly because of the frontage. It doesn't meet the underlying zoning requirement. You can't subdivide because you'd have to build a road, and that opening to the lot isn't even wide enough to meet our road standards. So this lot right now has just been sitting there, not being used. It's about an acre in size. And so we thought, okay, well, let's just illustrate what could be done here. So our consultant decided to do a few different scenarios, all of which show 9 units. So option 1 is the cottage court style. These are all detached single family homes that are about 900 square feet footprint. And each one gets their own parking space, but there's also some shared parking space. But the key point here is that they're clustered close together and they're oriented around a shared open space. So the front of these houses is actually facing towards the open space and the back is facing towards the one-way like driveway that goes around. And then from the street, it just looks like a normal 2-way driveway coming off the road. So that would be kind of one way to do this. Another one would be to put in duplexes and triplexes. This is a little bit more efficient use of land. This area does have triplexes and some 4 units, so it would still fit in with the same development type around it. Another option would be to do attached townhomes. So kind of similar to the last option. And then finally, another option that we put out as an idea is to have something that our consultant called a mansion apartment. I'd never heard that term before, but we do have them in Keene. We have these really old, like Victorian style homes along some of our gateway roads that have been split up into multiple units. So this one in the picture has, I believe, 8 units in it. So that's an 8-unit building, but from the front, it looks like a single family home. So that's another sort of infill option that we wanted to put out there. So this was brought to the community. We sort of shared those ideas and we asked them to share their ideas with us. So we gave them a piece of paper with that same empty blank lot and asked them, okay, what would you put here? What do you want to see here? Like, pretend this is in your neighborhood. What would you want to see? And we got some really cool, I put an example up here, but some really creative ideas. And what was surprising to us is that most of the people that did this wanted to see more units on the lot. They're like, well, why are you only putting 9? You could squeeze like 15 in here. So that was kind of cool. We also asked, we had up a series of posters with different types of housings and pictures so that people could say, okay, if the surrounding neighborhood is single family homes, this is the type of housing that I think would be appropriate. If the surrounding neighborhood is duplexes and triplexes, this is what I think would be appropriate. So we kind of got a little bit more nuanced feedback about the types of housing that people would like to see in different areas of town. And so that was that first public workshop where before we even put pen to paper, we asked the community to tell us what they would like to see. Then we kind of went to the drawing board, analyzed all the feedback that we got, came up with some guiding principles that we thought made sense based on what we heard. But then again, before we even started drafting an ordinance, we went back to the community. We held another public workshop where we did a little bit of a deeper dive, broke out into different breakout groups where we had them talk more in depth with each of the different guiding principles that we had come up with to kind of truth check them, make sure that that we got it right. And we got, again, what we heard from the community is that we weren't going far enough, which was really great to hear. They were encouraging us to allow more mixed use, and so we ended up taking that into account with the final ordinance. We did have a little bit of tension that we ended up resolving by making the ordinance have some incentives built in for both workforce and senior housing. So if it's age restricted or if it's designated as workforce housing, they get some incentives related to the parking requirements and things like that. But overall, there was pretty much consensus that what we were proposing would make sense. And so this slide just gives an overview of basically where we ended up. So this overlay ordinance is allowed in all residential districts where we have water and sewer available. So the city of Keene is lucky to have water and sewer. We said that, so that's the overlay. If you're in a residential district and you have water and sewer, this is an option for you. You do have to go through a conditional use permit process, which is a trip to the planning board. But the parcel size, there's no minimum, no maximum. The dwelling unit size has an average gross floor area of 1,250 square feet, but the building footprint can only be 900 square feet. Again, that's going back to trying to use land more efficiently, and we're trying to fill the need for smaller format housing, so that's why we have those caps. There's no minimum or maximum density requirements either, which we thought we were gonna have to put a maximum density in there for the community to be comfortable with it. They told us, no, we don't care. So that was surprising to us. But I will note that we do have impervious coverage maximums in all of our districts that these developments will have to comply with. So whether they do it as a single site or they decide to do it as a subdivision, we would be looking at the project as a whole and making sure that they meet the impervious coverage maximums for the underlying zoning district, as well as our drainage and stormwater runoff requirements. We do, again, because we have so much of our community is at risk of flooding, we have floodplain considerations. So the city of Keene has a floodplain ordinance. It's actually not in our zoning, and that's intentional so that developers can't get a variance from it. But in the city of Keene, we do not allow any new structures in the floodway. You can build an addition to an existing structure if it's in the flow of water. But other than that, it's not allowed. In the floodplain, you have to build compensatory storage so that there's no reduction in the net flood storage capacity of the floodplain. And the city is really strict about this. Even the New Hampshire DOT came in and did a big bypass project and tried to say they were exempt, and the city won. And so they just actually completed a 17-acre-foot compensatory storage area in Keene, which is awesome. So we even make the state DOT comply with it. And then with the cottage court, we do say if your building is located in the floodplain, in order to encourage parking underneath or some sort of use underneath that's not living area, we said that the height of the first floor is going to be measured from the finished floor elevation or base flood elevation plus one foot, whichever is less. So that because we have a height maximum, this way they get a little bit more room to put the floors above where the flooding will occur. So, and the goal there is to try and encourage, hopefully, for parking underneath the building or something like that. So I'm gonna pause right there because I know I went through that really fast, but that is the ordinance that we just passed. We haven't had any actual proposals come forward yet, although we've had meetings with, I think, 4 different developers to talk about potential projects. So there's already been a lot of interest. So hopefully we'll have something that we can show for this soon. But yeah, go ahead.
When you mentioned the floodplain maps, we're talking about the ones that they're in the process of reviewing and releasing now, or the ones that you can split up? Because they're really different.
Are you talking about the new FEMA maps that they're creating? I don't know very much about that process. Right now, we're just using the ones that are officially out there. But if the flood maps change, it will apply to, yeah, the floodplain regulations apply to the FEMA floodplain areas. And we do say in our regulations, anytime someone makes, so if you have an existing development in the floodplain, and you're making an improvement to the building or you're adding an addition, any addition has to be brought up to the floodplain regulations, or if you're increasing the value by like 50%, I think it is, that you have to bring the whole building up to the floodproofing standards. And you have to do the compensatory storage for the whole thing.
You should look at those new maps.
Yeah.
They'll let you look at them. They're not released yet, but you can look at them. It's completely different. I think they use LiDAR, and so they're much more detailed.
Yeah.
It might be big difference for you.
Yeah. Cool. Yep. Oh, go ahead.
Did you say that your cottage court overlay, there was a mixed use component to it? So the ordinance, it just doesn't just push by use, so say like a coffee shop in this area would just have to adhere to the same square footage standards as well? Or?
So it is mostly just allowing residential, but we heard from the community like, well, we already have coffee shops and little grocery stores and things in our neighborhoods, and we want to see that. We don't want to disallow that. And so the way we wrote it into the ordinance is we have very specific commercial uses that would be allowed and daycares, but they have a maximum square footage to keep them more neighborhood scale, and they are required to have housing above them to keep that mixed use, and really emphasize that this is really trying to increase the amount of housing in our community. So it allows for mixed use with some limitations. Yeah. But yeah, coffee shop is in there, grocery store. Yeah, so. All right, I'm gonna just quickly run through some other tools that Keene has used for a while now that kind of work in concert with the cottage court overlay really well. The first one, we do have a surface water protection ordinance that includes all surface waters, including vernal pools, which is why I have a picture of one up here. So we require a conditional use permit for certain activities that are within this buffer. There's other activities that are just flat out prohibited. You can do things like gardening and, you know, that's allowed in the buffer, but otherwise you pretty much have to come to the planning board for a conditional use permit, or if it's an activity that's not allowed, it would be a variance. And so this is another overlay district that we've used as a tool to help protect surface waters and protect water quality. We also have a steep slopes ordinance, which affects a lot of the area in our rural district. So prohibitive slopes, it's 25% grade or higher. You can't do anything on them. And then between 15 to 25% grade, you can do some activities, but you have a maximum area of impact that you have to stay below. It's pretty high though. I think it's 20,000 square feet. So, so that does set limits, and certain uses areas of the city, we do require a conservation subdivision. So this is a subdivision option where you take, your density is based on the overall tract size. You're required to put at least 50% of the tract into permanent conservation, and then you can cluster the units and have smaller lot sizes on the remaining portion of the tract. It is, it creates a little bit more flexibility. It reduces costs for developers, but it also is, so in Keene, we've said that this is actually required in our rural district and in some of our other districts where we don't have water and sewer. So this is required. If you're going to do a subdivision in our rural district, it has to be this type of subdivision. And then another thing that we've done relatively recently is we've modified our accessory dwelling units to make it allowed by right everywhere in Keene where there's an existing single family home, again with a maximum size. And I know I'm running up on time. So some final thoughts. One thing that we are really trying to think about, because it's really tricky, is our existing housing, and not to forget about that and how to protect that, which I think the last presentation was really geared towards. And then good planning and data analysis can help build the foundation for effective policies. Having that housing needs analysis done prior to doing this ordinance was really, really helpful because we could point to data. Like we had some people coming out and saying, well, our population has stayed the same. So the housing crisis is a myth. We don't need more houses. And we're like, well, actually the data shows that because our household sizes got lower, there's actually a higher demand for housing. So it does help kind of dispel myths and help get everyone on the same page as to the need for housing. And then for us, I think really building in a lot of flexibility can help developers come up with a good quality design. If they know what your community is looking for and they have the flexibility to do that, it can create a good win-win situation. So we're starting to see some really creative ideas come forward, and I hope some of them actually get done. But it's only possible because there's so much flexibility in the ordinance. And that's it. Okay.
Thank you. We now have about 10 minutes left for a break before we go to our participatory workshop. Feel free to stretch your legs, grab some water, extra snacks, and bathrooms are down the hall on the right. Please be back for our next session, which starts at 10:45.
We don't go over. Grab a coffee.
That's a problem with cities too.
Perfect. All right. Wonderful. So officially, I'm Krista Daniels. I work for Antioch University here in New England, our New England campus. Not many people know, but Antioch is part of a much bigger system. We have campuses on the West Coast and in the Midwest, along with now we're partnered with Otterbein University in Ohio. So lots of campuses all over. The one in New England is where I'm at, and is also where our Center for Climate Preparedness and Community Resilience resides. And so I direct the Resource Management and Administration program there. I'm also a senior program officer for the Center for Climate. And our goal has been to really work with communities on building climate resilience, but at the local level, not the national level. And so quickly, before I get to the topic at hand, which is participatory decision making, let me just quickly give you some basic definitions in case I use them. Again, like we said, some of these are conflated and sometimes people use different definitions. So when I say it, you know what I'm talking about. When I think of climate migration, I think of these three buckets. So mitigation, everybody knows, I think, pretty well. But it's, how are we going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? And with specifically the goal of to halt the rate of change. We're not going to stop climate impacts, but we can halt the rate of change so that we can start adapting, which is a lot of the work we're talking about here. In order to protect ourselves from the current impacts, whether that's flooding that we're seeing now, high heat days, and also prepare for future impacts. The last piece of resilience that doesn't get talked about, I think, enough is this bucket of justice. And this is where in our work in climate resilience, we're really prioritizing the individuals, the communities, the neighborhoods that are most exposed to harm right now. And when we think about also thinking about helping them adapt, we're also talking about solutions like energy solutions, clean energy solutions. Are we implementing projects that are helping those populations, or are we causing more harm? So that's something we're always thinking about. And the reason we talk about climate resilience is because it's one of the ways to reduce vulnerability. And so thinking about vulnerability, again, another three buckets, everything will come in threes, you'll see, just like the triples before. Exposure is one piece. That's the impact. That is the actual flooding. That is the high heat. That's the ice storms. Those are things that are hard to control outside of mitigating for the future. But we do have control with sensitivity and adaptive capacity. That's where we can have the most impact. And we think of sensitivity as what characteristics make something more susceptible to harm. So think of a parking lot. A parking lot getting hit with flooding might have less sensitivity than a basement apartment that gets hit with flooding. So thinking about that in that way, what things are more sensitive to the impact? What's going to have maybe a bigger problem in our community? And then the last piece is adaptive capacity. And that's thinking about systems, and mostly human systems with our natural systems, so our social systems, our political, our economic, our institutional systems. And can they anticipate, respond, cope, and recover from the impacts? So this is thinking about, a very tall building, many floors, senior citizens located on the top floor, high heat wave, 95 plus, no street trees, no AC. They have maybe very little adaptive capacity to get away from that harm. Maybe they don't speak English. Maybe they can't drive. Maybe they have no money. So all those things contribute to how much adaptive capacity they have. So when we're thinking about the subject of conserving land and affordable housing and bringing it together, we're also making sure that our housing that we're creating is resilient. And so these are the kind of things that we're consistently looking at. And now for the topic at hand, and this Room Enough for Both comes from, I don't know how many of you have gone to the Massachusetts conservation meeting that happened not too long ago, where Rosenberg came up from Scenic Hudson and basically said, it doesn't have to be either or anymore, that we can have both. And healthy communities need affordable housing and protected land because it provides clean water, food production, outdoor access, climate resilience, housing. And so some of these pictures, one of these on the right, you'll see is from Vermont. The rest are other aspects of how we can have both. So you heard Polly talk a little bit about how you can have a parcel, right? And you can conserve land if it's the right size, the right location, and you can have housing. You can also have a city or town, like as big as Singapore, that has done great advances in terms of biophilic principles, which is where we take nature and instead of having a separate park, the city is nature. So they bring nature into the city to create habitat, to help with air, water, food production. And in this country, we see it in even smaller scales, these biophilic principles being pulled into our towns. And here's one from Oregon, where they've been able to take sites and figure ways to bring in pretty much blue-green infrastructure instead of gray infrastructure to help with flooding and other things. So the land is the common denominator here, right? It's needed for both to have housing, and you need it to conserve for land conservation, obviously. And so now we need to think about how we can move forward with these two different areas to achieve both. And so what are the barriers? I heard some before from Polly, but it's really important to think about what are the barriers we are facing to be working together, both organizations. If you work for a conservation trust, if you work for a planning agency, you work for affordable housing, what are the barriers we are facing to actually come together to just work together? And I put some pictures as little hints on what they could be. What do you think? You could just raise your hand or let me know. What are the barriers we're facing to move forward with the two groups?
I
Beth?
really tend to think in terms of scarcity all the time. So everything's limited. Land is limited, resources, everything's limited in terms of it. And instead of thinking more about, outside the box, that, things can be shared, regenerative kind of thinking.
Yeah. What were you thinking?
Indifference.
Indifference.
Because people don't think anything is limited.
Other ideas? Yep.
Well, upfront costs, and then something that Patty certainly has had is opposition to projects.
Yeah. Other things you're seeing in your work? Yeah.
There's like a tension between a public initiative and then a private result.
Yeah. Definitely.
Adaptability to things that change in a project.
Yeah.
Like the cost of construction.
Yeah.
Increased significantly in the last few years. You have a project that is approved and is moving forward, and then you find out that it's going to cost twice as much to make, and therefore you have to change the project to have more affordable housing units to make it economically viable. Many people didn't agree with that, and so it makes it more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all of these are all mostly included in here. And yes, they're important barriers. And I say that because when we're trying to bring these groups together to work together, we have to think about ways to overcome those barriers. So as you stated, mission differences between the two. Each type of organization sometimes thinks that the other organization's goals are irrelevant or impede their progress, right? So that's a really important barrier we have to overcome. Constituency differences. Historically, land conservation organizations have been wealthy individuals, mainly white, with resources, while affordable housing organizations tend to be people of color and lower resources, and also in the public's eye, sometimes are thought to serve one population, right? Just those residents, while they sometimes think of land conservation serving an array of different residences. Whether it does or doesn't, that's been a historical kind of misconception, I think. Competition for funding, right? And competition for land. So depending on where you are, land development is happening at a very rapid pace. And so there's this idea of land scarcity in terms of that one greenfield, where are we going to put housing or are we going to conserve it, right? Siloed funding. And I think it's great, Polly, you're here because you're one of the national examples, actually, your organization, of how in different areas and states we can have some kind of board that starts thinking about funding both projects simultaneously or in a complementary fashion, because usually the funding is siloed and then there's all these legal frameworks you have to jump through to access different types of funding. Land speculation and individual wealth accumulation, that's the little Donald Duck guy. We know what happens with land speculation, right? The way some of our taxes are set up and our property taxes are set up is that there's an incentive for people to buy land sometimes and just wait. Not put it in conservation, not do anything, maybe make it a parking lot like in New York City, and just wait until the surrounding property values go up, and then they can sell it for a very high value. So that's also something we have to be thinking about. And then something we've experienced here, the amenity trap. And we actually saw this during COVID and the pandemic. And that's where what happens is people are moving into an area for its amenities, whether it's being able to be outside and not in a city. And as they come in, it causes displacement and it raises the cost of housing, period. This also can happen with conservation residential cluster developments, right? Like we have to think about ways of ensuring when we're going to build this clustered housing that has access to this wonderful green space, how do we ensure with policy and other forms of incentives that it is accessible to all people, that it's not really high in cost so that it no longer becomes affordable for people. And then human emotions. I think somebody mentioned that here. The idea of this is the way I've always done it, these are my perceptions, and this is really important to just conserve this land. We can put the housing over here instead, but human emotions come into play. So how do we get there to be working together across these groups? And this is really important for folks that are working for a conservation agency, a housing agency, or even a planning department, because you're going to be responsible, right, for having these conversations. So how do you get everybody in the room to start talking about how do we even build relationships and work together? How do we authentically collaborate? And, part of this is, what are the shared values between the two different groups and their organizations? And how do we build relationships to come together for solutions? And so what does that look like in the space in terms of collaboration, right? The Lincoln Land Institute had said, in some really best practice examples, we see the provision of affordable housing and land conservation in a way that addresses community need, centers justice, respects existing organizations, and localized knowledge. And so when we put that together, we've seen a few areas like Vermont and also the Hudson Valley region where there's a couple things that they're doing to start working together. It keeps coming back to, first, what are our shared interests and what are the opportunities that exist between both organizations? How can we leverage our collective strength to try new pilot approaches? How can we advocate for changes in policy together versus separately on the things that we have shared? And then how are we going to start communicating to our respective organizations, our boards, our constituents, the policymakers, and the public on why we should be working together, like the need and what the outcome could be. So for the rest of the time here, what we're going to try to do is delve into this field of participatory decision making. Has anybody heard that term before? Yes, 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 perfect. And this is a great place to use this. And the reason why is that when we all come together, like if we're bringing these groups together to think about how are we going to do this in our community, how are we going to do this in the state, what happens is kind of this diagram, right? This is what we think happens. There's a new topic, there's all these diverse opinions, there's all this divergent thinking, and then we start consolidating our thinking and we start agreeing on things, we refine it, we come up with solutions together, and then we come out with a plan or we come to a solution. That's how we're hoping it looks. Unfortunately, this is what happens quite often. So you have all these differences of opinions. Everybody's hashing out what they're trying to, either say through emotions or what their values are or what they're looking for. And it kind of gets stuck here. And what happens is people are like, this is taking too long. We're stuck. We need a decision. We were supposed to do this in like 3 meetings. And so they make a decision here. And the decision here is not always a bad decision, but it's not based on convergent thinking. So what happens is not everybody's really bought in. They say they are okay with it, but when you try to implement, this is exactly why plans get left on the shelf. They're not going to come out and support it. They're not going to actually do what they need to do for that thing to actually get funded. So it's extremely important for us to be thinking, how can we get to the closure? And part of the process is getting through that groan zone, because it is a groan zone. When we get here, after we've talked about all the things we care about and this is what we want to see, that's where people get frustrated. And that's where people get angry. And that's where people finally say, okay, I'm done. So we need roadmaps to get over this groan zone, right? To get to that convergent thinking where we can actually come together and talk about possible solutions that we all will be bought into. So this process is built on 4 key principles that we use quite often when we're working with groups on participatory decision making. And there are 4 main values. Today, we're going to really focus on the top 2, and we're going to do an exercise just to practice in terms of the mutual understanding. I'll kind of go over the last 2 just a little bit right now so you know what we're talking about, but really the first 2 are some of the key pieces to this. Full participation. So when we think about full participation, we're thinking about inclusion and we're thinking about belonging. What's the difference between those 2 words to you? What do you think the difference is? To include, inclusion versus belonging.
Well, we can include people and see that everyone in the town is there, let's say.
Yep.
But if we aren't listening and not validating what people are saying, that if they don't feel like they belong and they're wasting their time, you just check the box to invite them.
Yeah. Other things you've seen?
Acceptance.
Acceptance.
I have for belonging, it's kind of like being in community, and somebody once told me that to be in community with somebody or an organization, each party has to reasonably expect they can influence the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yes, meaningful participation, right? So we need to make sure we're including all the stakeholders. I hate using that word, but I haven't found a better one yet. But everybody that has a stake in the outcome, no matter who they are. And so what are ways to ensure we're having inclusion in this field of affordable housing and land conservation? Who would you try, like, how do you get those folks to the table?
Pizza.
Pizza, food, yeah. Yes, food, definitely food.
You invite them.
Yep, you invite them.
Childcare provision.
Yep, childcare, definitely.
Stipends.
Stipends, yes.
Or you meet them where they are.
Meet them where they are. See, you're doing a great job. You said everything I was going to say here. Yeah, really important, thinking about what the topic is. Having one meeting is hard for people, so are you going to meet them where they are and have these conversations all over? Keen did a great job with this in meeting in a box, basically they did for their visioning plan years ago. And then there's personal invites, there's childcare issues, there's offering food, right? Time, where, exactly, all those things. And then also, who's doing the asking? Who's asking them to participate? So we always got to take a step back and think about who can be the person that's asking them to come to the table, because is it somebody that they're like, it's not somebody they normally work with, or is it somebody they respect? Is really important as well. And stipends, very important. Every grant we write now, every grant Antioch is involved in, we put like 20 to 30% in stipends to get people to come to our engagement. We're giving them stipends for their time. Because if we're not doing stipends, if you want to hear from somebody and they're working for a nonprofit or they're working for a service agency, they can't take time away from work. They're doing it on their own time sometimes. And they have a million other competing priorities. So it's really important to make sure that everybody can come. Now, what about belonging? How do you make somebody feel like they belong when they come to your meeting? That's even harder. Yeah.
Well, you invite their perspective, build introductions, invite their perspective, and or appreciate the perspective. Let them know that is an important part of the discussion. Nobody's marginalized.
Right.
I think going to where they are is maybe the easiest way.
Yep.
Is there at least someone around the table who I know or who looks like me?
Right. Very important. Yeah, all those are important ways to structure your meeting and to ensure that you're helping people feel they belong. If you're having a meeting, equal seating. So normally like table rounds around the table. So nobody is hierarchically like in more of a position of power. You want people to all feel they have an equal voice. Welcoming people when they come in. Hi, nice to meet you. We're so glad you came. Little simple things like that. Also talking about why they're here, like why their voice matters. We want to hear from you because you're working so hard on this housing issue. We want to hear from you because you're working with the people that have no homes in our community. Like whatever it is, kind of making that connection and letting them know that you actually value what they're going to contribute, so that they feel like they have meaning to provide.
How about having the people who are organizing the meeting, that they not do too much of the talking, or that they not talk over the invitees?
That's right.
We don't want them
Yeah.
to seem as though they're the know-it-alls.
Yeah, exactly. Establishing group norms right away for folks. And, really also reviewing the agenda of what you're going to do with these wicked and these hard types of conversations and kind of the goals of the meeting. So everybody knows what to expect when they're there. And then, like you said, giving equal voice. And so the couple skills we'll be practicing today are difficult, although a lot of people here are not in a situation where there's existing conflict and tension. So we're just going to try to make conflict and tension to practice. But it's still hard. It's hard to have these types of active listening skills and to practice some of these tactics. And so there's no way people can become experts at this in 20 minutes or 15 minutes, whatever we're doing here. But it's good practice, and I'm going to have some handouts, and it's like the beginning of the process of learning how to really be an active listener and to really improve facilitation skills so you can come into groups and you can help. Even if you're not the facilitator, it doesn't mean you can't take a facilitation role to help the group move forward. I find that happens quite a bit with people that are really good at active listening, that come into a meeting and are helping the group move forward, even if they're not the official facilitator. So very important. The mutual understanding is really thinking about the other person's perspective. So this is where the active listening skills will come in. So we're going to practice some of those active listening skills, but it's being able to truly hear what the person is saying and put yourself in their shoes without judgment. So the first part of this exercise, as you'll see, we're not here to come up with solutions. We're just going to practice hearing from each other on what's important to them and practice that active listening so that you're not thinking about what you're going to say. You're not thinking something else, but you're truly hearing them. And there's some ways to do that, because I find sometimes when somebody's speaking, I'm like, oh no, what am I going to say after that? Should I include that in my presentation? And I get sidetracked in my head and I lose track of what the person is saying. And that is one of the reasons why we have a hard time coming out of that groan zone. Inclusive solutions in a participatory decision-making process, inclusive solutions are what comes out at the end. Everybody feels they have a stake in the outcome. Like they feel that that outcome works for them. It's not consensus, but it's not, I can live with that, and they just walk away. It's a little bit more. It's kind of in between. And then shared responsibility is something I think we always forget about these solutions or these plans that are coming out. That is the place where we're willing to stand up and fight for that to happen. So we're not an active participant anymore. We worked on it, we worked on the plan, and we're willing to come to the meeting. We're willing to showcase our support. We're willing to actually vote for that thing to happen, whatever it is, without, I'm kind of bought in, I'm not, I'm just gonna say no, because I don't know if my voice was really heard, right? So what we're gonna practice, and we'll do this in like 20 minutes in a couple groups, and then we'll talk about it, are these couple skills. One, we're going to be in these groups, and I think we're going to be in 3 groups or 2, depending on how many people we have. We're going to try either the concept of generating ideas. So this is when you're in a group, one person I'm going to assign as the facilitator for that group. They'll start the process, but I want everybody else to try being facilitator, like try these skills out. So the person's going to open up and say, well, for the next few minutes, feel free to just express your ideas. They can be unpopular ones. There's time for generation, not for judgment, right? And so people are going to talk about what they think about the proposal that we put forth. If you're in a really large group, this is what I like to do. It's called stacking, right? And this is what usually happens in community meetings or bigger groups. And that's when you take a flip chart and I say, how many people want to talk about, how many people have something they want to talk about on this subject or this question? Like, who wants to speak? And I will say, Mary, she'll raise her hand, Mary number 1, Beth number 2. I will put a list of numbers. And then what you do is you go through them. So nobody thinks that they're losing their place to actually give input, and everybody gets a turn. When you get to the bottom, you say, okay, we're going to make another stack. How many people still want to talk? How many people want to talk again? You do a whole nother stack. And you keep doing that for a while until you get to a point where you do tracking. We're not going to practice tracking here as facilitators, because you're all going to be facilitators. But tracking is the 4-step process, is that after you do a lot of this, you kind of take a step back and you say, all right, so far, we're seeing that these conversations are at play. We need a lot more affordable housing, but we're not sure where to put it. We're trying to conserve this area of land. We have a proposal for development there. There's all these different great ideas out here. Is that what I'm reading from the group? And you're checking for accuracy. And then you say, okay, like adding this, adding that. Let's resume feedback, and you keep doing your stacking. So you keep getting feedback in until everybody feels like they've said what their thoughts are, and you're going to move on to another question. I love the cows. So when people in the group are talking about the question I'm going to put up there, we need to paraphrase what somebody says, or we need to mirror what somebody says. So now the facilitator can try this. So if I say, Marie, in your group, you're the facilitator, I want her to practice. Beth, I heard you say you want this proposal because you feel we have too many people without homes in this community. Whatever it is, that's paraphrasing. You try mirroring when it's hard to paraphrase. Like you're not really sure of the intent, so you're going to say exactly what the person said and you're going to say it back to them. But you're going to say it in a warm and neutral tone. These two things, doing this, ensure that you are listening to every word that somebody is saying. Because you can't be thinking about how you're going to respond. You can't be thinking about something else if you're going to paraphrase or mirror. It is actually like a check valve for you as a facilitator in a conversation and to make this process go forward. Because you can't be thinking about anything else if all you're thinking about is how I'm going to paraphrase or mirror what that person's saying. So what would be good to do in groups is everybody try that. So if Marie is the facilitator and Kyle says something about there's no way we can have single family zoning eliminated in my town, it's just going to be crazy development. Beth can try to say, Kyle, I hear that you think it is impossible for us to have single family zoning in our town because development will be, rampant. Is that what I heard you're saying? And Kyle will respond, well, there's more to it. But I want everybody to try it. Everybody try mirroring and paraphrasing. We're not going to spend too much time on this, but just a little bit. And then comes the drawing out. And that was the part I was getting at. So Kyle, why do you think development is rampant? And what are the issues with development you're seeing? And this is the place where you're like, what do you mean? Can you say more about that? It's not just clarifying questions. It's kind of drawing somebody to explain their position. Like, why are they upset? Why are they worried about that affordable housing unit? Are they worried about crime? Are they worried about traffic? Are they worried about viewshed? What is it, right? So trying to draw them out. And I'm going to give you packets that have all this in there, so you don't have to worry too much about this, so you can look at it. And then lastly, we're going to look at when there's hopefully opposing views, because I picked a topic that there should be opposing views. What other ways are there of looking at this issue? Does everybody agree with Kyle? Or does everybody agree with Beth? Like, who do you agree with and why? Tell us what you're thinking. Validating comes in if somebody gets angry. It'd be great if somebody gets angry at the table. And so, or upset. And so a facilitator would say, I see that you're really upset about that. I know you must be upset. I get how that feels. Can you tell me more about why this matters to you? So just trying to validate somebody's emotions, because a lot of the time, that's what we get in these kinds of meetings, is very emotional charges and responses. And the last thing to practice is legitimizing differences. This is very hard because most of the time you're in a place where you kind of align yourself with one or the other, right? It's very hard to always be neutral, but that's where we start and practice neutrality. And that's where we're saying, Beth, you bringing up really good points that we need more land conserved in this community. It's important for, as you said, us having clean water, food production, clean air. And at the same time, Kyle, you're talking about how we are so short on housing. That's a great point, because we can't have our our teachers, our firefighters, our farm workers, nobody has a house. So how are we going to solve this? So you're both bringing up really good points. Who else has thoughts on this? But really trying to legitimize that everybody in the room, what they're coming with, are really good points. Because that helps us start to work through that groan zone, because you're not going to get to the outcomes until you work through that groan zone. Because like we showed before, even if you think people are okay, sometimes it's just because they're like checked out, we're done, I'm stuck. And what happens is at the end, whatever you're looking for a solution, whatever solution that is, will not have the support or buy-in to actually get pushed forward. So really important to build those relationships, especially with organizations that are not used to working together, is what we find. So we're gonna try this. And I'm just gonna set up a couple more things before we split up. We're gonna talk about this. There's a proposal to eliminate single family zoning in every community in the Upper Valley. Gone. And so you're coming together to talk about this proposal. Is that smart? Like, is it gonna work here? Is it not gonna work? What are your concerns about that proposal? Why would you support that proposal? And so we're gonna have dialogue rules in even our little groups, because people sometimes get really excited about these things. And so we're gonna practice active listening. Remember, you never know if you're gonna be with the one that's gonna paraphrase or mirror. So really listen to what everybody's saying. We're listening to learn, not find anything flawed. There's never gonna be a right answer. This is, again, easy because it's a game. It's like just an exercise. We're trying to seek discovery versus outcomes. This is not the part where we're looking for solutions. This is the part where we're trying to understand everybody's perspective on an issue. And then the last thing I would say is beware the curse of knowledge. And this is because people use jargon. So you come into a room and somebody says Act 250. I don't know what Act 250 is. I do, but what if I didn't? I'd be completely lost, and then I might not speak because I'd be worried to speak because people would realize I don't know what I'm talking about. Never use acronyms. And don't assume everybody knows what you mean with words and definitions. So as you're talking, try to explain things out, right? If you're worried about steep slopes, what's a steep slope? What does that constitute? You know, like, try to explain everything you're talking about. So I am going to hand out these wonderful packets that you can go home with that really give you how you do some of these. We can leave, everybody has one here. So that talks about gathering ideas. How do you validate, like, tactics to use? How do you balance? How do you legitimize differences? And what we'll do is we'll try to split up. We can't split the room. We might move some people from this side to this side. Around 3 circles, I think we're gonna have, because we do pass it around, I think. There's more coming. All right, so what we'll do is first we'll divide up. So we'll take the... All right. All right, let's come back together because we're running out of time. I was able to participate in 2 groups, sort of, but I missed you guys. So, what did that feel like? How was that?
Stressful.
Why was it stressful?
Well, I'm autistic and I have ADHD, so it is really hard to even just paraphrase things, because my interpretation is completely different sometimes than what's actually being said.
Excellent point.
And that would be really helpful, though. So, like, if you are not hearing what they're saying, repeating back what you're hearing allows clarification. Absolutely. So that way, like, with the paraphrasing, that person can be like, no, that's not what I was trying to say, and then try it again. Yep. And so that way that helps get people on the same page.
Oh, and were you facilitating?
No. But we all took it.
But they all tried it out.
We all tried it out. Yep.
So I have ADHD and I facilitated. It actually helps me to be the facilitator.
That's why I often will volunteer to take notes at a meeting, because it makes me focus on listening.
Great. Yeah.
Not thinking ahead.
Right. And those are important points that you need to be thinking about when you come into this process. Like, what can my role be where I feel comfortable? Because you shouldn't feel stressed out all the time, like, especially if you're involved in this. But what could it be? Maybe it's not the full-scale facilitator in your case, but maybe it's once in a while, I really didn't understand what they said. Can I ask a question? Can you repeat what you said to me? Or repeat for the group to understand? How else did it feel for others? Mary?
I felt pressure to choose a side, but I'm I have like an internal conflict with this topic.
Yep.
And so it was really hard. It's like every time someone said something, I was like, okay, do I agree with or disagree with that? And I was, no, just listen. So that was really hard to like check my impulse to like pick a side.
Mm-hmm. Polly.
I found that we did a lot of idea gathering.
Yes.
But was thinking as a facilitator, wait, what's the next step? Are we supposed to move on from this? What are we supposed to be doing? We can question. We went out of control.
Go ahead.
I thought
Sue.
our discussion did actually draw out a lot of different points of view, clarify what we're talking about, and why do you care about that? And it broadened the conversation. It went deeper, and we we're still drawing it out. So I felt like we were already making progress and actually hearing each other.
Yes. How about the group I was involved with in the back? How did that feel?
Along the lines of what you said, I think you said, as the facilitator, I didn't, or maybe it was what Polly said, I wasn't sure where to lead to, where to go next. We had a lot of concerns and questions and ideas, but I didn't read the book.
No. Go ahead, Barbara.
It would have been helpful if we had had something visual to have some key phrases on to go back to.
Yep.
Because if I'm trying to listen to the person that's talking, I've already forgot what the person before that said. And that's hard to build on ideas if we didn't have something visual to go back to.
Absolutely. For a real process, you'd have a scribe and a flip chart, and somebody would be taking notes for you. They would even do, if you were trying the stacking, they would do the stacking for you, so you're not doing it yourself. So they would help you like write all the numbers down so you don't have to get lost in your head with all of that.
A good question that came up here afterwards was, how would we actually implement this in our own community? And it seems like something that would almost require outside expertise, or are we being trained?
It's kind of, your
process here. Yeah.
I mean, I think everybody has a comfort level with facilitating, right? So some people are going to want to facilitate a process. City planners facilitate processes all the time, right? Engagement processes. Marie might facilitate a process too with other conservation groups and the trusts, land trusts. So I think if you're in a facilitation role in general, where like you're bringing together a group to talk about anything, this is good practice. Like these are good skills to have for any topic. If you're going to have a meeting between affordable housing organizations and land trusts, right? You want to make sure that your facilitator is using these. So if you're vetting, you might just be putting an RFP out or hiring a facilitator to come in to do this. You want to make sure they're doing this, right? That there's a lot of active listening and that there's time for that back and forth, so people are heard. So in our group, we were talking about if one person is concerned about traffic, if one person is concerned about losing open space, there's 5,000 other people that are not there that are going to say no, right? So really hearing from the people that are concerned and then getting to the why. Right? Like, what is it? Is it the traffic? Is it there might be more conflict among people? Is that it's just too busy? Like, what does that mean? And what are you worried about? Are you worried about it when you're in your home, on your property? Are you worried about it downtown? Like finding all this out, because you need to bring this. It's like putting all the, stuff on the table, right? Because when you start talking about solutions, to get that buy-in, right? To get that buy-in we talked about, you're going to need to address that, because there's going to be so many people that can't come to the meeting for whatever reason that will have that viewpoint. And so you're bringing all these things. And what we talked about was, how can we ensure that, how do we deal with traffic that comes with this? How do we deal with crime? How do we deal with protecting open space? Like, what are all these things? What are these solutions that address what people are scared of? How do we put that all together? And it might not be grandiose, but it might address things that people are fully bought into. And that's really key, that active listening and nobody wants to spend the time hashing things out. But that's the groan zone. You have to hash it out. You have to continually hash it out until everybody feels that they've said what they can say. And then we start talking about what are some solutions to all these concerns we've talked about. And you all know it, like somebody at our team, like our table said, you have a public meeting, somebody comes up there, they voice their concerns, they're upset about something, and then they leave. And that's it. And you know all their neighbors. They're talking to all their neighbors now. And so the key is, how do you create a process where they can talk about that and not be judged? Where they can come to the table and tell you why they're worried and not be judged. And we can keep going through like the issues that are underneath that emotion. It's hard. But practice, and you can do this in a meeting yourself. Like if you're in a meeting not facilitating, you can raise your hand and say, can you repeat that to me? I think I heard you say this. Can you tell me more about that? You can do the drawing out. You can be the person that raises your hand and tries to legitimize the differences. Like, oh, I've heard in this meeting, you care about this because of all these reasons, and that's really important. And I heard you care about this for all these other reasons. So who else here has ideas on how what might be similar? Like what can be shared? What can we move forward with? How do we reconcile those differences? Are there things we haven't thought about yet? All right, so I'm going to quickly, it's 11:57, that's the one thing I always commit to is time. Okay, so Marie, do you have any events or anything? No, that we want to talk about before everybody goes?
Right now.
Okay, perfect. You're going to hear more. So a couple things you should know. There is a proposal in with Antioch and Dartmouth and a bunch of other universities, same that came together for the first grant for climate migration, that are looking to create a climate adaptation, basically clearinghouse for our region, because our region doesn't have one. It is going to look at housing and affordable housing in particular. So stay tuned for that. The other thing I saw before, Marie, you brought up, I don't know if you know this, but I'm working on a proposal to NSF with Eric from Dartmouth on how this region is going to deal with flooding erosion from flooding.
What's NSF?
National Science Foundation. I almost didn't know. So, because I just say it like that all the time, and I almost didn't know. So we're doing something like for the Upper Valley. So thinking about how we're going to deal with that, since it's not inundation flooding, but it's this erosion flooding. So that's something to keep on. The last thing I'll just say is that, because this is as if you're training to be a facilitator for your own meeting. 3 things. When you bring people together, don't use icebreakers anymore. People hear that word icebreaker and they're just like, So do something like content before collaboration, so that they know we want to hear your opinion, we want to hear what you have to say, and it's getting us ready to work together, collaborate together, versus an icebreaker. So that's one thing we're finding out in our like social psychological research. The other thing is, there is this thing called serial positioning. That's why I have a little cereal box of my son's favorite cereal. But when you go to a meeting and you're doing a training and you're doing a workshop, people remember peaks, right? But 80% of people only remember the end. So the key to this is always start strong, right? But finish stronger in whatever training you're doing. So if you want people to take action at the end, really try to finish with something, a funny picture, some kind of advice you're giving people, but just, it depends on the workshop you're doing, but finish stronger, because that's what people are going to remember when they walk away, 80%. So usually it's uplifting, not something, that makes people sad and feel like they don't have efficacy, but think about what you're going to say at the end that can uplift people. So thank you all for coming. If you want to do more facilitation, like if you're thinking, I want to work more on facilitation, just contact me, because we're going to set up more trainings that really go into this, like in really real topics, like specifics. It's not for everybody, but if it's something you're interested in, just contact me, and we'll try to set that up for groups. Thank you. Thank everybody for participating. Yay. All right.